So good morning, everyone. Welcome to our workshop on the Calumet County Brownfield Coalition Assessment Grant. Thanks for joining us. As you may have noticed, this is going to be recorded, and it will be sent out to everyone after the workshop, and it will also be put up onto our Brownfield webpage off of our Economic Development County website. So thanks for joining us. If you do have questions throughout the workshop, I just ask that you hold them until the end. There will be a time for questions at the end, or you can put them into the chat and we can read them at the end of the presentation too. So the next slide. So today's presenters are going. I have two great presenters joining me today. One of them is Harris Byers with Stantec, and the other one is Tori Ippolito from the US EPA. My name is Jason Pausma. I'm the Economic Development Director for Calumet County. So today I wanted to take the opportunity to familiarize everyone with the Brownfield grant that we have and sort of how we got to where we are today. Back in 2019, my predecessor, Mary Carell, applied for and received an assessment grant that was in the amount of $300,000 from US EPA. That grant was for assessment work only in Calumet County. Back in 2022, the county applied for a coalition assessment grant with coalition partners, Outagamie County and the Fox Cities Greenways. And we were awarded that grant back in 2023. So it's a $1 million coalition grant. Calumet County is the lead agency on it and is responsible for all the reporting and finance. And then Outagamie County and the Fox Cities Greenways are our coalition members. So what is today's workshop going to cover? We're going to go through what a brownfield is, where and how the funds can be used, what is eligible under the grant, the goals of the Brownfield grant program, other funding sources that can be used to address brownfields besides the EPA grant, recent brownfield redevelopment success stories, how do you nominate a site for assessment through the grant, how the funds will be allocated, and then finally questions and answers at the end. So first, what off is a brownfield? We're going to just use the definition straight from the EPA. A brownfield is a property, the expansion, redevelopment, or reuse of which may be complicated by the presence or potential presence of a hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant. And I want to kind of key in on the word potential. Usually when you think of brownfield, you think of a site that is polluted, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. It could be just the potential presence of pollution. So it could be anything from a corner gas station, dry cleaners, to your kind of stereotypical industrial sites. Being that this grant covers a lot of areas along the Fox River, kind of historically, we have a lot of industry on the waterfront or on the riverfront that could be old brownfield sites. So where are the brownfield sites? Brownfield sites are everywhere. It's not just an urban issue. Some sources of contamination for brownfield sites could be just undocumented historic fill material. You see that a lot of times along the waterfront. I know when I was in Oshkosh, there was a lot of fill from like sawdust areas. It could be hazardous building materials, asbestos, lead-based paints. But again, typically it's kind of your former industrial, commercial, and agricultural uses. If you take a look at that map on this slide, that's a map from the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. You can see they're scattered sites all throughout, definitely concentrated in urban areas, but they are in rural areas. The green dots on that map represent sites that are closed, and the blue dots represent sites that are still active and open. So what are the impacts of brownfields on our communities? Well, there's definitely impacts to public health. Can be, cancer causing, it can be respiratory disease, organ damage, but then there's also tax-based implications and quality of life implications. Brownfields can reduce property values if they're blighted. You can increase crime. It can affect tourism, and then you think about your quality of life. It could also attract, your typical. You think about industries trying to attract talent, like all industries are. If you have a lot of brownfields or a lot of blight, it can make that harder to attract your talent to for your company as well. So why develop brownfields? Well, it's sort of an answer to that last slide. It sort of does the opposite. It can preserve green space and reduce urban sprawl. It reduces exposure to contaminants, so that's addressing your health. It can improve your neighborhoods, encourage reinvestment, and it can increase the tax base, promote environmental justice, and reduce contaminant load in stormwater runoff. So this next slide, I'm going to let Tori from the EPA tell you more about the different programs that the EPA has to offer.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Tori Polito. I'm a Brownfield project manager with EPA Region 5. Thanks to Jason for having me here today. So yeah, I'm going to give an overview of our program and the different types of grants we offer and some additional resources. Next slide. First, I want to give a very abbreviated history of the Brownfields program.
Tori, are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me? Yes, now?
Okay, we can hear you now. Yep, great.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Could you hear me before or no?
Nope,
Yes.
I think we might have missed the first part. You want us to go back?
Sure. Hey, good morning. My name is Tori Polito. I'm a Brownfields project manager with Region 5, and excited to be here today and talk to you about some of the different grants that we offer. So next. First, I'm going to give sort of a quick history of the Brownfields program, which comes out of the Superfund program. And that was created in 1980 to respond to the public health and environmental dangers posed by very heavily contaminated sites. And so originally, Superfund screened around 50,000 sites for potential inclusion into the program, but only around 1,200 made the list. And that left a lot of sites in limbo. And Superfund also created this liability chain of owners, operators, and generators of contamination at these sites. And that was very effective for getting them cleaned up, but it also had a lot of unintended consequences for the real estate market, especially with the court decision of the United States versus Fleet Factors Corp. And in that, a bank was found liable for contamination at a property that they foreclosed on. And so almost instantly, lenders stopped making loans at sites with potential contamination. And so the market for these old industrial sites really froze nationwide. And that hit those in the Rust Belt particularly hard. And new projects were really only being built in urban sprawl locations. And so then we have this 10-year period of really excellent creative collaboration between state and local governments, particularly in Minnesota, Illinois, Chicago, and Cleveland, to find ways to address this gap. And what they identified was the need for incentives to address these sites that otherwise wouldn't get cleaned up or redeveloped. And so after some successful pilot programs, the Brownfields Amendment was passed in 2002. And that defined what brownfields are, it clarified and provided liability protections, and it also authorized funding for our grant program. So next. So one of the grant types that we offer is assessment grants. And before I get into that, I'll say that our grants are open to different government entities, regional councils, redevelopment agencies, states, tribes, nonprofits, and community development entities. They're also competitive. So that means that they go through an application process where the applications are reviewed and scored against our criteria. And our solicitations usually come out in the fall. Back to assessment grants, these can be used to create a brownfields inventory. So this is things like taking the time to compile a list of the brownfields in your community. Funds can also be used for site characterization, so identifying the past uses of the site. However, most of the grant funds typically go towards environmental site assessments. So whether that's researching the site history or taking actual samples to determine whether a site is contaminated, and if so, to what extent. Community involvement is another eligible cost under these grants. So hosting public outreach meetings, engaging local stakeholders, and choosing what sites to assess. And in that same vein, participant support costs are also eligible to support a community liaison. So these liaisons are meant to serve as a resource to ensure that the citizens' goals and interests are reflected in the planned use and revitalization of brownfield sites. And lastly, planning for site cleanup and redevelopment is an eligible cost. So these are identifying opportunities for redeveloping the site and developing those cleanup plans. Next slide. So we have 3 types of competitive assessment grants. The first being community-wide grants, which in which case there'd be 1 recipient. These are for communities that maybe are just beginning to address their brownfields challenges, or for communities that have ongoing brownfields efforts. And applicants can request up to $500,000 to assess sites contaminated by hazardous substances, pollutants, contaminants for up to 4 years. And the second type is our coalition grants, the type that Calumet County has. And these are designed for the one lead entity to partner with 2 to 4 other eligible entities who might not otherwise have the capacity to apply for and manage their own EPA cooperative agreement, and otherwise wouldn't have access to our resources. And these are up to 1.5 million for 4 years. And the last type we have in this category is our community-wide assessment grants for states and tribes, which we call CWAG Street. And this funding is only available to states and tribes for them to address brownfields throughout their entire jurisdiction. Next slide. We have a couple other grants too in our program, the first being cleanup grants, which, as you might assume, are to carry out cleanup activities at brownfield sites, and applicants can request up to $5 million. We also offer multi-purpose grants, and so these are to carry out a range of assessment and cleanup activities, as well as planning and community engagement. And so these are oriented really towards communities that have already identified a discrete area, maybe like a neighborhood, a corridor, a census tract, that has 1 or more brownfield sites. And these are up to $1 million for 5 years. And last in this category is our revolving loan fund, or RLF grants. And in short, RLF grants allow the recipient to provide loans and subgrants to carry out cleanup activities. And then when those loans are repaid, the loan amount is returned to the fund to be relent to borrowers. So it helps create this ongoing source of capital within a community to address these sites. Next. And so the last grant I'll talk about is our Brownfields job training grants. And these are a little different than the other ones because they're more about people than assessments or cleanup. But the job training program is for nonprofits and local governments and other organizations to recruit, train, and place unemployed or underemployed residents of areas affected by brownfields. And the goal is really to help graduates develop the skills to secure full-time employment in the environmental field. And it can be quite a life-changing program for the students who go through it. So it's a really excellent program. Next. And then pivoting from our grants, we also offer technical assistance to communities and other stakeholders on brownfields issues. And the provider for our region, which is Region 5, is Kansas State University. And they can help with things like preparing grant applications, performing site inventories, reviewing historical information. And their website is ksutab.org. Next. And the last thing that I'll touch on is our 128A funding, which is non-competitive funding that we give to states and tribes, specifically for capacity building, site assessments, cleanup, and program development. And so that's really just to say that your state also has brownfields funding and resources that you could seek out as well. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Tori. So how do you address brownfields? This slide shows a kind of a really high level process involving 5 steps of how to address brownfields. The first step in the process is the site identification or nomination. And that's really one of the purposes of this workshop today, is to get you to nominate sites in your community. Once the sites have been nominated or identified, you can go on to the second step, which is the site assessment. And that can involve the phase 1 or phase 2 environmental studies. The phase 1 environmental study really just researches the site history. It takes a look at historical uses. It determines recognized environmental conditions. And then finally, it would recommend whether a phase 2 is necessary. Now, phase 2 would actually go out and do the work of collecting soil and groundwater samples for testing, and then identifies the locations and the levels of contamination on the site. Once that's done, you go into step 3, which is really your site planning and reuse. Here you can go beyond the phase 2 and do supplemental investigations, which will confirm the full extent and levels of contamination, determine how your development may occur. And it can also involve remedial action planning, where you actually develop a strategy for redevelopment based upon the types of contaminants you have and allow for safe reuse of the site. Once you do that, you can get into the project financing. The EPA grant can be a part of that capital stack. It maybe wouldn't necessarily be this assessment grant, although it's part of the process. But as Tori mentioned, there are remediation grants or cleanup grants or revolving loan funds that could be used as part of that capital stack. And then finally, you get into your remediation and redevelopment. This grant does not cover that cleanup work. That cleanup typically could be excavating and landfilling soil, capping the site. You could pump and treat groundwater, put in vapor mitigation systems, etc. One exception maybe to cleaning up that you might not think of would be if there is an underground storage tank on the site. This grant actually could potentially cover the removal of that underground storage tank in order to test the soil or the water below that tank. Next slide. So how do you address brownfields? The focus throughout the process is to focus on how the site can be reimagined to a bigger and better use. Does your community have a vision of a future use for that brownfield site? Again, you want to go through that development strategy based upon the types of contaminants and proposed redevelopment. Sometimes the site redevelopment plan is dictated by the types of contaminants in the site. Capping the site can involve a variety of options. It could be permeable green space. Capping the site could be a parking lot, or sometimes it can even be a building can be used to cap a site. And oftentimes there may be a building on site that may have asbestos or lead-based paint that can be reused as well. Next slide. So what are the eligible grant activities under this coalition assessment grant? Again, sort of a background, this grant is a $1 million grant. It's a 4-year grant that started in October 1 of 2023, and it goes through September 30 of 2027. Any site that is located in Calumet County or Outagamie, Outagamie County is eligible. The property does not need to be publicly owned. I want to emphasize that. It could be a privately owned property. So what are the eligible activities? It can be anything from that phase 1 environmental study that I talked about in that previous slide, all the way through that remedial action planning. So it's your phase 1, phase 2. You can do asbestos or lead paint studies. So that's additional site investigation work. And then this grant also covers community outreach and education, which is what we're doing today as well. Next slide. So the goals of the Coalition grant, once again, are to implement either a county, city, village, or town comprehensive plan. And if your community has a focused redevelopment plan, it could implement that as well. It's definitely to bring blighted properties back to life. It can be redeveloped into a mixed-use site, housing, industrial, or even that open space, green space. It addresses the community needs through redevelopment. It enhances recreational opportunities and provides a higher quality of life, protects that human health and safety, improves our local economies, increases the local tax base, and leverages additional funding. So the next slide, I'm going to turn it over to Harris with Stantec, and he's going to go through a few examples of successful brownfield redevelopment projects. Harris?
Thank you, Jason, and thank you to those who are on the call today. Looks like we have 28 people, so thank you for taking time to join us this morning. I hope for the next couple of minutes I can share some meaningful redevelopment
Harris,
success.
we can't hear you. Is your mic on?
Yes, it is. Can anyone hear me?
Yeah, we can. I think
Oh,
some
you
people
can. Okay.
There must be a delay. Sorry, Jason. So, my hope is that in these success stories, you're going to find pieces that relate to your community. And the reason for sharing them is to try to give those on this call, villages, towns, that kind of courage to bridge that gap between doing something today and the fear that there may be some risk to the community balanced against the overall community benefit. So I'm going to touch real quick. Rick, go ahead to the next slide. There are several funding sources that are available to communities that are, in some cases, available to private developers. And I've worked with a lot of communities in Wisconsin, in the Midwest, and truly across the United States, solving a lot of brownfield kind of questions. And one of the common things that come up in these conversations are, well, we as a community are often anxious in getting involved in this process. In other words, either acquiring a brownfield or just facilitating some assessment work to make a private transaction go through because they feel uncomfortable. This slide kind of summarizes two large entities that fund brownfields. You're not alone. There are resources out there for communities if a community decides to take on a project, or at least that facilitation. The first are the two federal programs that we see more commonly used in brownfields, and you heard from Tori a few moments ago, and that's US EPA. The Environmental Protection Agency has created one of the most effective federal programs to generate direct, meaningful improvements, honestly, in local communities. Second one's US Department of Agriculture has a program to support rural brownfields, especially. So if there are small communities on this call today who are interested in taking an active role in your community's future, we can certainly talk about that as some additional funding. There are two state agencies in Wisconsin that participate in brownfields redevelopment through kind of several programs. The first is the WEDC, the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation. Now, their grants often require a match. The first one that we see leveraged most often is a site assessment grant program. And the advantage to all those on this call, if you decide that you're interested in doing some kind of meaningful brownfield investigation improvement, the US EPA grant that was awarded to the county can be counted as the match against a site assessment grant that you may also be interested in. So there's a lot of synergies between federal and state programs here. The second is a brownfield cleanup grant program operated by WEDC. Lastly, the DNR, Department of Natural Resources, offers two programs. The source of funding for these two programs is the US EPA. So there's, again, a lot of parallels between what the Calumet County grant will be accomplishing as well as the DNR program. So, and now I could kind of go slide after slide after slide and put you to sleep on all these funding sources, but I think it'll be more meaningful to talk about three case studies. So the case studies I'm going to talk about, I'm going to kind of weave in some ideas about how local communities have participated in various phases of this redevelopment and how communities have been able to stack various federal and state grant programs together to kind of make some successful projects. All right, next slide. I want to start with, for those on this call, I want to start by challenging your perspective. And the first thing I want to ask, when you think about a successful brownfield redevelopment project, what comes to mind to you? Is it the next gigantic, massive economic powerhouse, or is it simply cleaning up a property. And I think it's important as the communities on this call, think about how Calumet County's grant could benefit your community, to think about what means to be successful in your community. Depends on your perspective. Is it, again, simply cleaning up a property? Is it leveraging public investment, creating jobs, giving opportunities to local small businesses, removing blight? These are all positive, and I've highlighted this word, outcome. Because ultimately what we're trying to do is improve communities with positive outcomes. 3 case studies. And the first case study is going to focus on a situation where the county had to foreclose on a piece of property. The second case study is a project that was actually quite meaningful to me, and it was quite eye-opening. And it comes out of Calumet County's first assessment grant. And lastly, kind of the more capstone, the large, sexy, beautiful projects that make, gorgeous posters at Brownfield conferences. I want to touch on one of those simply to give you a sense that there is a gradient between small business all the way up to these very large municipal projects. All right, next slide. Let's jump into the first case study. This is a case study in Calumet County. It's referred to in a lot of paperwork as Quinney Plating. The name should give you an indication of where it's located. It's in the Stockbridge Township, more or less on Quinney Road, loose geography. It's about 2 acres of land. It was a dairy in 1946, meaning the site would process local milk. Turned into a cheese manufacturer in 65, multiple mixed uses by 71. And sometime in the 1990s, a small metal plating cottage industry kind of was born in the basement of this structure. And that's sort of where we find ourselves, in a very interesting situation where a cottage industry, in other words, a relatively small scale industry, sort of sprouts up in otherwise rural parts of the state. And we see this actually played over several times. So let's talk about how this case study kind of unfolded. Next slide. So this is what the site looked like the very first time I saw it. I mean, very clear indications of visual blight. The siding's falling off the building. It's immensely weathered. The lead paint's kind of chipping off. You can tell this otherwise would be, considered kind of that blighted, weathered structure. Next slide. So when Calumet County first walked into the site, now some kind of slight backstory, the site had fallen into fairly significant tax arrears. So the county had been working with the property owner and over many, many, many years trying to get the site to move forward. But eventually the county made the decision, and again, this is Calumet County, to foreclose on this property. And it was actually a very wise process to do that. This is what the site looked like on their initial county visit. The roof had been compromised. There was tremendous improper waste storage. There were various wastes. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this was a metal plating facility. So inside these drums, bottom left-hand picture, these are 55-gallon drums full of acids, solvents, bases, plating salts, things that otherwise, if you would go to a license, a highly regulated plating facility, you don't just keep drums of hazardous waste with plastic and plywood over the top. Quite worrisome to the community. There's a high capacity drinking water well on site. So we have this kind of worst case facility of hoarding hazardous waste with a high capacity and well on site. Next slide. So the county had to foreclose on this, but in doing so, and this is kind of a major lesson learned for those on this call, if you're in a similar situation that you're thinking you may have to do a foreclosure action to move forward on a property that could be a risk to your community, I invite you to call Calumet County, call the treasurer's office, talk to Mike. He's learned a lot of lessons through this process. The first thing was to set a plan of action. In doing so, kind of following that flow chart to the top, in setting that plan for action, the first thing the county did was to try to identify all the liability protections available to them. The first was a liability protection from CERCLA, which Tori alluded to earlier. And the way that the county kind of documented that protection was through completing a phase 1 prior to acquisition. Unique to Wisconsin, the Department of Natural Resources has a program, and the abbreviation is LGU, that provides liability protection at the state level to units of government who have to, and similar to the case of Calumet County, step in and acquire a brownfield site. It's going to give you that protection from NR 700, which is the state code that normally would require a property owner to follow a very tight timeline in completing the investigation and cleanup. So once Calumet County had figured out their liability protections, finished their phase 1, got their LGU protection, the outcome of that was they figured out their continuing obligation. That's kind of a fancy term of figuring out the next steps. What does the county need to do in order to move this site forward? From that, they were able to secure funding, and I'm kind of illustrating their funding stack as kind of a money bags in the bottom central. The reason I want to kind of use the little money bag as an illustrative tool is to give you a sense that the county didn't pay for this all on their own. That's the number one takeaway message. Calumet County was actually quite proactive, and they sought funding through DNR from 2 EPA programs on the bottom left-hand corner, plus then the EPA Brownfields grant to the top right, stacked with WEDC, stacked again with a WAM application. And so the county has stacked lots of public funding to take care and to try to move this otherwise very expensive and blighted property forward. Next slide, please. I'll talk to you a little bit about what the site meant in the context of the community. I'm showing you a couple of other really disastrous photographs. Again, top left-hand corner, I mean, these were drums of hazardous waste simply laid in the basement of a building with plastic over the top. If you pull the plastic off, bottom left-hand picture, you can kind of see the floating salts that were in there. For those that are from Wisconsin, you recognize the blue buckets on the top right-hand corner from Fleet Farm, the one underneath it from Menards, and these buckets, 5-gallon buckets full of hazardous waste. Clearly, this was not a site that was being operated properly. The threat to human health and the environment simply comes from this: improperly stored large quantities of hazardous waste with a failing roof. There is a high-capacity well, it's 460 feet deep, completed through the Maquoketa Shale, meaning that if one of these buckets was to fall over, get a hole, get knocked over, the roof collapses, and that hazardous waste went rolling across the floor. It's a direct conduit from that hazardous waste down into the regional drinking water aquifer. This is the kind of stuff that that a hydrogeologist such as myself, I mean, just kind of panic over. And those that are on this call, if you're into community development health, you would absolutely share the same anxiety that Calumet County had. So there was no choice. So the first thing the county had to do was address this threat. Next slide. And that's when the guys in the moon suit show up. So in 2019, the county was able to secure assistance from the EPA Superfund program, and they removed 11 tons of hazardous waste out of this site. The guys in the moon suit show up, they're packing drums, they're moving, again, this immediate threat to human health off the site. Well, once the really hazardous materials left, well, the county was still saddled with this site and this building. Next slide. And that's where the EPA assessment grant came in. Now, again, this is the county's first assessment grant from EPA. Bottom left-hand corner, so the county knew they needed to demolish the structure. It was completely unsafe, but in order to do that, there's, of course, the pre-demolition work that has to be done. Bottom left-hand corner, taking samples of that stained concrete. In the middle, the lead-bearing paint and asbestos surveys. Bottom right-hand corner. And this is a fun story to tell to the local community. There were lots of rumors, of course, that there was this buried railroad car. And in fact, there was a railroad car that's supposedly buried in the 1940s and used as a fuel oil underground storage tank. And so the county's assessment grant was used to take the tank out of the ground, again, complete all the pre-demolition and kind of waste characterization surveys. So with that amount of information, next slide. From that, the county was able to secure a WEDC grant, and combined with a small amount of county funds, abated the asbestos, and ultimately, right-hand picture, demolished the building. Next slide. So now with the building gone, the site investigation can be completed. Sampling soil, sampling groundwater, especially those areas I showed you earlier where there were these drums of hazardous waste just haphazardly stored throughout. We're now able to start sampling soil and sampling groundwater, sampling drinking water. And that's sort of where the site currently is today. Next slide. So although we don't have a big, sparkly, beautiful new building sitting on the site, I think from the community's perspective, the question of is this a successful project? I think the answer is overwhelmingly yes. The first reason is because it's removed that risk to human health and the environment. Again, the county did not pay for this. It didn't come out of general funds. This was the county proactively leveraging relationships and resources from DNR and from EPA to move forward on this kind of project. It removed 11 tons of hazardous waste, sealed up the groundwater supply wells, secured the site with that big perimeter fence and site inspection, and most importantly, demolished unsafe buildings. So if those on this call, if you can think of sites that might fit this same model in your community, let's talk. Lastly, certainly the county was very proactive in leveraging multiple funding sources to do, again, the work we just mentioned. Next slide. I'm going to give you another case study also in Calumet County. And for me, as a Brownfield practitioner, I'm sorry if I forgot to mention this, I work for Stantec. I work in the environmental consulting industry. I work with communities similar to Calumet County all across the United States, from South Florida up to the New England coast and westward, including some collaborations in Alaska. So I've gotten a really wide perspective in communities tackling these projects, but this project is one I'll never forget. There was a funeral home in downtown Brillion. There was a small business owner who had sort of interned and sort of followed a journeyman's approach under the previous funeral home operator. Now, this young entrepreneur, small business owner wanted to acquire both the building itself and the business from the previous owner and occupier, simply to kind of build their future. So there were a couple of environmental concerns. The potential purchaser in this case, now this is important to remember, this is privately owned land that was going to be sold to a private party. Calumet County's role in this simply was to facilitate that transaction. And so the county used their EPA grant to do a phase one to kind of satisfy the requirements of the U.S. Small Business Administration. And for those on this call, the SBA backs loans for small businesses that need kind of additional support. We'll just call it that. A couple of environmental concerns, gasoline underground storage tanks, perhaps, management of on-site fluids was something that was kind of new to me, but of course, this being the funeral home, the mortuary business, there were some questions about that, as well as some typical fuel oil kind of things. There was a dry cleaner across the street. So we confirmed if these potential concerns, the top four, are genuine risks. And again, the whole point was to support this property transaction where a young small business owner is interested in investing in the community and investing a lot. So next slide. This was immensely successful because using a few dollars out of the EPA grant, again, awarded to the county, we're able to complete a phase one, complete a phase two, the property transaction went forward. I think this is successful because it gave this opportunity, Sarah on the bottom left-hand corner, to build a small business, leveraging multiple funding sources, certainly on the federal side, backed by SBA and then a traditional loan, but also personal. So Sarah and her husband on the bottom right-hand corner put a lot of their own personal finances together to create a capital stack. So it's kind of satisfying, I guess, from one hand in my side of the table to help two amazing folks build a small business in a community that they're vested in. And all it took to kind of close that gap was a phase one and a phase two from the county's EPA assessment grant. And that was funding that Sarah just absolutely did not have. So I think this was successful. So again, those on this call, if you can think of small businesses that are looking to expand in your community, perhaps a phase one and a phase two is all they need to kind of go over that gap. Last case. This is the exciting one. All right, case study number 3. Now, these are truly the municipal scale. I've given you the first one, which is a county that had to foreclose. The second one, a very small business. The third one is a transformative project in the city of Manitowoc. That's, of course, Manitowoc being your neighbor from Calumet County further to the east. It's on the Manitowoc River, and of course, the Manitowoc River does go through, or the headwaters are up in Calumet County. The Manitowoc River discharges into Lake Michigan about a quarter mile downstream from this peninsula that was formed in the Manitowoc River. Next slide. Communities in the 19th century had to really think about the highest and best use in kind of an initial development scenario. So I'm going to give you a quick summary. At the bottom left-hand corner, this was a bird's eye view drawn in 1868. You can see the peninsula that's formed in the Manitowoc River. So about 1878, this was the first drawn plat map in Manitowoc, but you kind of outlining the site I'm going to be talking about in green. You can see very clearly immediately, especially those in community planning, you can see there's a street grid. The downtown street grid has been extended from the east all the way to the west to touch the river. The parcels themselves are individually platted out with the intent of continuing the kind of downtown high density commercial residential all the way to the west of the river. Well, 1895, the site was completely wiped. There was a lot of development, kind of post 1878 of housing. There were a couple of blacksmith shops. 1895, the site gets wiped. And the reason is why. Why would a community give up 21 acres of land in their downtown core to wipe it clean in the late 19th century? And that is because of railroads. Railroads in that 19th century gave Manitowoc direct connectivity between the Great Lakes Shipping Channel and the national rail grid. Next slide. So this is what the site looked like. I've kind of outlined it in a dashed red, more or less. This was a panoramic photograph taken from the tower directly across the street, directly across the river from the site. Massive railroad turntable. They were turning cars roughly 2 miles of railroad track on the site by this point in time. But again, it gave Manitowoc direct connectivity to the national railroad infrastructure, as well as then connecting to the Great Lakes shipping to bring raw goods in and export finished goods out. Next slide. And it lasted through the 20th century. Roughly 1980s, there was a bad ice storm. The railroad depot actually that would carry passengers collapsed, and so the railroad largely walked away from the site roughly in the 1980s. Now, the community is sort of left with 21 acres of land in their downtown core, a linear mile of river frontage left to rot for 30, 40 years. Now, the problem becomes, well, what do you do with this piece of land? The city was in negotiation with the railroad, and if anyone on this call has ever negotiated with the railroad, you know this is not an easy task to acquire the property. Redevelopment planning started in the 1990s, but the concept of reconnecting that street grid really took hold in 2019 when the city was able to acquire it. The city decided, well, they're going to make this a destination space. We see this over in Appleton as well. It's really beautiful redevelopments where the city's bringing in high density residential in addition to the street grid and green space to bring people back downtown. Next slide. Starting in 2020 through 2022, brand new infrastructure comes in: roads, boulevards, sewer, water, gas, electricity. The photograph in the background, a wonderful multifamily redevelopment, finished and is open. Next slide. Building out in 2023, we start work on some of the green space, some of the parkway, some of the park lands, a marina that's going in. And what I'm showing you here from this picture, this is cleaning up the shoreline. Some of the old railroad infrastructure had failed, causing some sediment from the upland to kind of enter into the river. So we're doing a huge cleanup in here to clean up sediment out of the river, stabilize the riverbank, again, creating that green space to kind of facilitate more commercial and residential redevelopment that's going to be starting this year. Next slide. Looking at the financials, at the project initiation, and this is something that I think communities often struggle with, is accepting the fact that when the project starts, and we represent funding sources by gray and blue and orange wedges of a pie chart, the EPA assessment grant, when the city first started this project, it was a fairly significant portion of the project. It's certainly with the DNR stacking their money in there as well, but 80% of the cost was, of course, burdened by the city. This is not uncommon. But after that initial redevelopment, private investment all of a sudden becomes the biggest part of that pie. And on the right-hand side, that final project, when all is said and done, we're anticipating about 86 to 90% of all the money that's been spent on this piece of land comes from private sources, and that cities share at that point becomes immensely small. So you can kind of see on the left-hand side how the city making a small investment, certainly leveraged by EPA and DNR assessment funds, results in a fairly significant private investment. Next slide. If you were to look at these little pie charts by scale, right? So the project initiation was $1.6 million, and that's a pretty small pie compared to the initial redevelopment. And then if you look all the way to the very right, that final project at roughly $1.75 million, 1.74, again, that light blue vastly overwhelms the amount of assessment funding or the amount of city funding. So for communities on this call, sometimes that seed money provided by the EPA to do the assessment work, or DNR or WEDC or your local community, can really serve as the founding or sort of give you those resources to move a very significant project forward. Last slide. I think this is immensely successful. Certainly, we've reconnected that downtown street grid. We've made roughly a linear mile of river frontage now accessible again, increasing housing options, removing that risk to human health and the environment, and leveraged multiple funding sources. Next slide. I'm going to pass this back over to Jason, because I hope the 3 case studies that I've shared with you, you've been able to identify yourself in some capacity or projects within your community. So I'm going to pass it over to Jason to kind of help you understand how to nominate a site or project for assessment work under the county's grant.
Great. Thank you very much, Harris. So we're wrapping up here. We got a few more slides to go, but I'd like to cover, as Harris said, how to nominate a site in your community. We're going to have a Brownfield site nomination form on our county Brownfield page, which is on our county economic development page. That will be on the site probably in the next week. We will also be emailing a link to this video afterwards to all of the stakeholders and include that nomination form as well. So once we receive the nomination, we'll review it between our coalition members of Calumet County and the Fox Cities Greenways. And then the sites will be presented to a Brownfield Advisory Committee. A Brownfield Advisory Committee has been formed, and the goal is to meet quarterly on an as-needed basis. The committee is comprised up of members from local chambers, some in the banking industry, housing authority, private developer, commercial broker. So there's a good cross-section of stakeholders on this committee. And that committee may approve or deny a nomination and rank them if we have more sites than we can fund. For small time-sensitive projects, such as a phase 1 that might be tied to a property transaction, where it is, like I said, time-sensitive, we have reserved the right to, as coalition members, approve that project outside of the Brownfield Advisory Committee. So why might a site be denied for funding? Well, of course, we need to have access to the site. So if we can't get an access agreement signed by the property owner, it wouldn't be a good candidate. And also, sometimes you have a private property owner that, for one reason or another, they don't want to have their site investigated. So if we have an uncooperative property owner, that also would not be a good candidate. And those questions will be on that Brownfield site nomination form. Next slide. How are the funds going to be allocated? We have, as a group of coalition members, sort of set aside funds in buckets, and we've agreed that Calumet County, as the lead agency, will, as a goal, have a minimum of $300,000 for priority projects. Allegheny County would have a minimum of $200,000, and the Fox Cities Greenways would have a minimum of $100,000. The remaining $400,000 would be run through the advisory committee. And again, this is not set in stone; it's a goal. If we get towards the end of the grant cycle and it looks like one of the entities is not going to be able to spend down their money, then of course we would reallocate that money to a project in another jurisdiction. Next slide. So finally, once again, the project team is Calumet County, Allegheny County, and the Fox Cities Greenways. For Calumet County, we have myself and Rick Sense. For Allegheny County, Kevin Engelbert and Sadie DiNatale Berta. And for the Fox Cities Greenways, Dennis Kittle is on the project team. And you have Harris Spires from Stantec as well. So if you do have questions after this presentation, please reach out to your county representative and we'll make sure your questions get answered. Last slide. So thank you everyone for being here today. Again, please promote this program within your community, and remember the sites don't have to be publicly owned. They can be privately owned. We just need access to the site. Again, following this presentation, a link will be sent out with this video. It'll also be on our county Brownfield site. Again, we're going to send out that nomination form to all the stakeholders in the communities. And with that, I guess I will open it up to any questions.
Jason, this is the city of Appleton. Is all of the work performed by Stantec?
Yeah, I'm not hearing any questions.
Jason, there was a question from the city of Appleton as to whether Stantec would be performing all of the work.
Yes, Stantec is going to be performing all the work for this grant.
Thank you.
This is Michael from Buchanan. Will you guys have some kind of marketing brochure or something that we can use to get this information out to our property owners in our communities to advertise it?
Yeah, I don't know if it's a technical issue. Is there any other questions? I see Michael Brown possibly is.
Yep, there was a question from Buchanan. Will there be marketing materials or brochures that our communities can send to property owners?
We're not planning on having marketing materials right now. We'll have our website that people can get basic information from, and we'd be happy to meet with any property owners as well.
This is Harris. I just want to kind of build on Jason's comment there. A lot of times in brownfield transactions, there are just a lot of questions that come up. So please, those on this call, don't hesitate to reach out. I'm happy to come and meet with property owners, potential purchasers, their attorneys or otherwise. We collaborate at Stantec with, a number of different consulting firms. So if there's a consultant that's already working on the project, we collaborate that way. If there's a consultant working for a potential purchaser, we can collaborate with them. So we truly are here as a resource for these communities to help these projects move forward. Please don't hesitate to call.
Any other questions? I think I'm having audio issues, so if there's questions, maybe Sadie, you could let me know. All right, well, hearing none, I'll just say thanks again for joining us, and look for an email with a link to this presentation, and that can be shared with any stakeholders and your property owners in your community as well. Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks.